In its most traditional sense, the term apostle was associated with envoys or messengers by the ancient Greeks. Apostles would be sent to deliver a state message to large crowds, and they were often exceptional orators, which was a much admired characteristic back in that day. Aeschines, one of the 10 Attic orators who are considered to be the greatest orators of the classical period, was technically an apostle when he was sent to Megalopolis, Arcadia, to address an assembly of 10,000 strong and urge them all to unite and defend against Philip of Macedon, the father of Alexander the Great. As Christianity began dominating the global religious sphere, the term apostle began to be associated with the hand-picked disciples of Christ who were charged with spreading the word of the gospel to all the nations by the Son of God following his resurrection. Neither of these descriptions can be accurately applied to Kentaro Miura's interpretation of that term because, in his world, apostles are perhaps the most reviled beings ever. These demonic reincarnates exist solely for one purpose: to do as they will, and their wills are about as bright as the shadows within which they lurk. They do spread the gospel of a certain divine entity within the astral realm of Berserk, but it is not out of a sense of teaching or benevolence, and it is certainly not related to positive enlightenment. So, let's talk about what they are and what their existence means for this story, shall we? This is What Are Apostles? Explained. At first, they were presented as demonic entities that could shapeshift between human and apostle forms. The introduction of apostles to Berserk. If you're one of those people who heard about Berserk from your friends, got intrigued by the series because of its reputation, decided to check out what the hype was all about yourself, and then stopped reading after the first chapter because you were disgusted by what you'd just seen, then we're sorry for you. This is not only because you practically got baited into thinking Berserk is just a gore fest by your mind after everything Guts does and endures in the first chapter itself, but also because you didn't even quite understand what you saw in the first place. Because if you did, you'd probably be struggling for chapter 374 right now, just like us. From the very first panel of Berserk, one thing is made very clear by series creator Kentaro Miura. This story is going to be dark, in all caps. We start off the chapter with the protagonist clapping and then proceeding to blast through what we assumed was a succubus at the time, before she can send him to hell after giving him a taste of heaven. All of it happened so quickly that we didn't even have time to digest quite what transpired, and before we knew it, we'd arrived in the elusive township of Koka. As soon as Guts arrived at the town's gates, we understood just what kind of a place Koka was. Miura showed us panels of working girls, beggars, and indifferent knights sprawled across a desolate town. On his way inside, Guts noticed a carriage filled with women and children, which will become relevant soon enough. Have a little patience, guys. Guts makes his way into a local pub where he comes across a bunch of thugs harassing an elf, just the guys he was looking for. He incapacitates nearly all of them with no effort and tells the one guy he leaves breathing to deliver their master a message. The Black Swordsman had arrived. We don't know how you wouldn't want to read this story till its bitter end after watching Guts perform a biology lab dissection on one of the Koka boys, but we'll try not to get sidetracked by that line of thought anymore. After running around the city, trying to evade its guards, getting captured, tortured, and taunting the local mayor for willingly sending in tributes to his new monstrous overlord, this is where the women and children become relevant. Guts finds himself in a cell with nothing but a puddle of his own piss and Puck present for help. Puck helps heal Guts' wounds and even brings him the key to his cell door to facilitate his grand escape. But all Guts does is mock him and make fun of his assumptions and perception of the world. Naturally, Puck calls him a prick and ends up leaving the cell with tears streaming down his face, but Guts is just mildly amused by all of this. What he really came to Koka for was a hunt, and his prey was approaching him rapidly, as indicated by the heavy bleeding of the strange brand on his neck. Guts goes out into the city and disguises himself within a pile of corpses before taking on the leader of those thugs he messed up earlier, the Snake Baron. Earlier, when Guts was being tortured for his transgression of saving Puck by the mayor of Koka's subordinate, he revealed that he knew why the mayor was sending out women and children to the castle in a carriage, and he was also aware of the reason behind his own torture. The mayor tries to spit venom in his face by claiming he was utterly ignorant, but Guts' rebuttal shows that it was the mayor who actually knew nothing about the very man he served. Or rather, he did know, he was just really bad at pretending otherwise. As the mayor stumbled on his own words, trying to find a half-decent explanation for the Snake Baron's inhuman existence, he was shocked into silence by Guts, who said that he already knew about that. He said that he knew that the Baron was a monster that ate human flesh, and that the mayor was keeping up with his voracious appetite by sending him those aforementioned women and children. He called out the mayor's cowardly pretension that all he did was for the good of the town, when in reality, he was just looking out for himself. This got him thrown in that dungeon cell where Puck visited him, and the mayor decided that he needed to speak with the Baron privately to ensure that none of this came back to haunt him. How sorely mistaken he was. The Baron came to the same conclusion as Guts when the mayor showed up to beg for forgiveness, and he revealed another sadistic character trait of his kind in the process: their utter and complete lack of empathy for human lives. The mayor of Coca thought he was in a relationship of convenience with this evil Baron. He gives the guy gold and food, and in exchange he doesn't hurt anyone, especially the mayor himself. But as we know from the first friggin' panel of Berserk, these guys aren't the type that need handouts to maintain their dominance. They are more than capable of taking what they want when they want it. The Snake Baron chillingly informs the mayor of Coca that his little charade with the old man was just that, a game. He personally didn't even need a single reason to kill and devour humans, because that was all he and the rest of his kind lived for. When he rode into town looking for Guts, he brutalized townsfolk at random and even started feasting on the way to his target, showing the gluttonous nature of these beings. When he finally comes face to face with Guts, he puts a name to the type of monster he is, as the Snake Baron proclaims himself an apostle. Unlike any of the apostles we described in our introductory paragraph though, the apostles of Berserk were not messengers or missionaries. They were simply cold-blooded, shape-shifting demons that would kill and eat you without a second thought. At first, we thought that their monstrous forms were their real forms because that's usually how these stories go. Fiendish beings take on human disguises and lure targets before revealing their true forms. The woman from the first page of the Black Swordsman chapter was a particularly hideous kind of succubus, and the Snake Baron was clearly meant to be a depiction of the vile, lascivious side of humanity, as its true form was that of a humanoid snake whose face resembled a vulva. A lot of overtly grotesque and disturbing imagery is associated with the apostles immediately upon their introduction, which is a stark difference from how people associated with that term are perceived as being in our world. So far so good, Miura is a fan of subversion after all, and flipping the term apostle by associating it with demons instead of righteous humans makes sense. Only that's also a lie, because apostles are, technically speaking, humans themselves. We learn this when we meet the Slug Count, the third and final apostle we see in the opening arc of Berserk, as well as a few key things about what exactly apostles are. So let's dive straight into that, shall we? Are they demons in human disguise, or is it the other way around? Understanding the secret behind an apostle's existence. After moving on from Coca and surviving a rather harrowing night in the woods, Guts arrives at another city with an apostle ruler, and this time, it's the Slug Count. It's downright depressing that this amazing character was completely omitted from every adaptation of Berserk, because he not only serves as our gateway into understanding what apostles are, he also gives us an interesting juxtaposition of that term itself. See, the Slug Count is introduced during a public execution scene. As his minister prattled on about the accused's crimes, Guts made his way through the crowd that had gathered to view the gory spectacle and get a better shot at his target. What gave us pause was the minister saying that the person condemned to die was sentenced so harshly for being a heretic, which is the first time a divine association was made with an apostle in Berserk, at least from a cosmetic standpoint. After the accused is dealt with, their severed head conveniently finds itself at Guts' feet, who lobs it in the Count's direction and uses the blood dripping from it to make a slashing gesture towards his own throat, a sign that the Count was marked for death. The apostle catches the head, which Guts somehow managed to scratch a semblance of his brand onto in the split second between picking it up and throwing it, and crushes it with his bare palms in his human disguise. He accepts the Black Swordsman's challenge with baleful delight and sets his soldiers at him. But this time, Guts manages to escape thanks to someone who used to work for the Count. In that regard, this man was no different from the mayor of Coca in that they both were once part of a demonic human-hunting beast's retinue. But nothing else about these two people was the same. Vargas, who was the former physician of the Count, managed to give Guts and reluctant companion/emergency medic Puck an escape route straight to his own lab, where Miura revealed to us two shocking truths about these apostles. Number 1. Instead of being demons in human disguise, apostles used to actually be humans at one point in time. Vargas used to be the Count's physician before he became a mane-eating monstrosity, and it was only after the Count turned into an apostle that Vargas decided he had to flee his service. He ended up having to watch his former employer kill, mutilate, violate, and devour his wife and child, and he himself was not left unscathed, missing an eye, several teeth, both feet, and a massive part of what used to be his face. He explains that though his master had always had a bit of a mean streak given his fanatical devotion to his faith and his consequent habit of hunting down heretics, at least he was still human. Then, one day, after returning from a hunt, he turned into this evil creature that hunted humans not for the truth of his faith, but for sport. And it all started when the Count got hold of a specific object that he bought from some traveling merchant seemingly by chance, a behelit. Even the traders who sold the object to the Count were not entirely aware of what it was or what it did, simply telling him that they found it in a town bazaar in the east, but it would turn out to be anything but chance that made this egg-like artifact find its way to the Count. The behelit itself is initially described as a key that summons 5 angel-like demonic entities that have manipulated the dark side of human history since ancient times. Guts calls them the God Hand, as we get our first glimpse of Slan, Ubik, Conrad, Femto, and Void. But turns out, he was only basing this off of partial knowledge, because he didn't exactly know how to make the key work to summon the God Hand. He finds out how that can be done during his climactic showdown with the Slug Count, but it's clear that Guts is not someone that will be able to use it. After fending off multiple near-fatal blows from the Slug Count in his fully released half-slug form, Guts manages to corner his opponent by using his daughter as bait and then slicing off his dual head into 2 halves, before torturing the half that came off of him. As he does this, Guts doesn't realize that he knocked the behelit out of his own satchel, and this inadvertently teaches him how it works. Guts was going to town on the Slug Count's immortal head with his army knife when the Count began crying out of a desperate desire to simply continue living. The blood that was flowing out of his head pooled around the behelit, which rearranged its own features, a sign that the key had been activated. A surreal domain known as the Interstice descends upon the Slug Count's castle, and Guts finally gets to see the guys he was looking for this whole time, the God Hand. The Black Swordsman immediately tries to attack the God Hand Femto, calling him by his human name instead to remind him of their score, but the Quintumvirate is more concerned with addressing the arrival of the one ordained by the laws of fate, aka causality. For the entire duration of their presence within the Interstice, the God Hand pressures the Slug Count into accepting his heart's desire, which was to survive at all costs and give up that which was dearest to him in order to ascend again, which would be his daughter Teresia. The Apostle was not interested in the latter half of the bargain and wondered why the God Hand didn't just take care of Guts instead. The Apostles and the God Hand were supposed to be kin after a fashion, as they were refashioned into their current forms and given their current life purpose by the same abyssal entity, and Guts had slain countless Apostles by this point in the story, apparently. He calls out to the Archangel of the group, Void, and begs him to take out the Black Swordsman, whom he labels an enemy of the Apostles and by extension the God Hand itself. But the Archangel remains silent while his actual kinsmen scoff at the suggestion of equality. Even though they're both supposed to be demonic creatures, the God Hand claims that Apostles are nothing more than inconsequential servants whose lives are worthless. And those are direct quotes, by the way. The way that this ritual worked, for it was a ritual, was that the one who had been ordained by causality to arrive at this temporal junction, in this case the Slug Count, must sacrifice that which defines the last shred of humanity within their hearts, in this case Teresia, in order to fully transcend their mortality and become an entity twice reincarnated. This last detail is pretty rare because most Apostles don't get to have a second chance at a second life, or should we say a third chance at life, but you get the gist. We like to call the Slug Count mini-arc Apostle 101 because it explains a lot about their existence, at least from a thematic standpoint. As he struggled with deciding between himself and his daughter, the God Hand Ubik stepped forward and decided to help speed things along by showing him a montage of what happened the first time he became an Apostle, and this was equal parts fascinating and horrifying to witness. The Count was a cruel enforcer of his faith in his human life, but he was, for the most part, a just ruler and a loving, caring father and husband. However, his love was exploited by his wife, who ended up bringing a cult of deviants into the Count's castle while he was away on a hunt, and organizes a heretical orgy. the Count returns to the tragic sight of his wife clinging to a half-goat statue as if she were a sailor trying to stay afloat in a sea of flesh, and he snapped. He killed every pagan present in the room except for his wife, whom he just couldn't bring himself to kill. Instead, he tries to kill himself, but in that moment, his blood and his true desire to escape his mortal heart activated the Behelit in his possession and summoned the God Hand. They offered the Count eternal, painless life in exchange for one thing, a simple sacrifice. He would have to give up the thing he loved the most, or any other sacrifice would be meaningless, and given the Countess's recent behavior, he didn't even hesitate. Once he uttered the words that committed him to his new path in life, the brand of sacrifice was seared into his wife's flesh, and the Count devoured her in his new monstrous slug-like form. Since then, he's been stocking up more and more bodies in his cellar, all the while struggling with the fact that his daughter, the one thing he loved as much as his wife, if not more, won't even talk to him anymore because she gets who and what he is without even having to talk about it. In that instance, the Count had sufficient enough reason to give up on his wife and embrace his new life. But in this instance, nothing could make him sacrifice his baby daughter, which was instinctively sensed by the God Hand. Void cancelled the Invocation of Doom, the process by which a sacrifice is branded, and the Apostle transformation can begin, before the Slug Count could say no. And then we saw the kind of terrible fate that awaits you if you decide you want to become an almighty entity like an apostle. If a human being consciously decides to become an apostle and give over their lives to demonkind, then their souls, and the souls of their loved ones, belong to demonkind forever. All their fates are going to be the same, which is a one-way trip to the Abyss, aka Berserk's version of Hell, with the only difference being that the apostles get to enjoy their time on Earth in their second lives before finally passing away. Their sacrifices are often immediately killed and devoured, with Guts and Casca being the only two exceptions of the series so far. Because the Count rejected the God Hand's offer at his second reincarnation, he inadvertently committed himself to his ultimate fate, which was his soul being dragged into the abyss by a whirlwind of evil spirits. This scene is horrifying, especially the way Miura draws it, and what makes it even more unsettling is the presence of Vargas in the torrent of spirits, as the physician had cursed the Count before being executed himself, which made him end up in hell. The spirits also tried to come at Guts, but his trusty arm cannon got him out of that little situation. Teresia ends up blaming Guts for everything, and he tells her to come at him, but looks sad about it. Puck expositions all of this excellently, and the Black Swordsman arc comes to an end. After this, we see an apostle in the proper canonized portion of the Golden Age arc, when Nosferatu Zod pops up to battle Guts and Griffith in a two-door fortress, but we do learn quite a few things about them in this short time. Number 1. They weren't demons that assumed the form of a human, but rather humans who became a part of demonkind and could now transform into their true selves. Number 2, a Behelit was a fundamental ingredient in their creation. Number 3, to ensure one's ascendance into apostlehood, one must sacrifice that which defines their humanity in order to shed their mortal coil, aka their loved ones. And number 4, once you've done all this, you will have a one-way ticket to hell waiting for you when you manage to die again. But until then, the world was your oyster and you could do whatever you wanted with it, which was usually just murder, rape, cannibalism, the works. But these things just scratch the surface of what an apostle is from an astral perspective. The true essence of their existence is far more twisted and perverse than their actions post-reincarnations, but it also conversely has produced some of the most disciplined apostles we know, like Locus, Grunbeld, and of course, Zod himself. For you see, there is a connection between Berserk's apostles and the apostles of our world, after all. They both exist to spread the message of a higher entity, with the biggest differences being obviously the way they go about these things, but also the gospel they preach. The apostles were sent out by Jesus to spread the word of the gospel to all the nations of the world in a preachable and agreeable manner. The apostles of Berserk spread the opposite kind of gospel, not just through words, but their actions as well. And it would not be inaccurate to call what they do spreading the gospel of evil, because evil is the core of their existence and the technical, astral part of an apostle's unique nature that we're now going to get into. They are humans refashioned by causality and their own extraordinary obsessions into demonic reincarnations. What apostles are, how they're made, and why. In order to understand the true nature of what apostles are and why they behave the way they do, we're going to be focusing on 3 key phrases from the series. The first comes in the Black Swordsman arc itself, though it is pretty blink and you'll miss it. When the God Hand is explaining to the Slug Count just how the whole sacrifice deal works and why Guts isn't an eligible sacrifice, they mention things like the sacrifice needing to be someone akin to being a part of the Count's soul, like his daughter who we've already mentioned. Because Guts was just his enemy, he wasn't acceptable. Besides, he was already marked with the brand and the God Hand didn't do rebranding, so he was ineligible from the get-go. They then start working their manipulations on him. Ubik says that by giving up this part of his soul, he would be able to sever any remnants of his humanity and truly become a heartless demon with a grin stuck to his face as if it was the best thing ever for someone. Conrad, unprompted, then mentions that a fissure in your heart will open up into which evil will surge. At first, this statement felt like nothing more than a throwaway line that was more metaphorical than literal. By giving up his last shred of humanity, the Count would become a true demon or something like that. But then we witnessed the eclipse towards the closing stages of the Golden Age arc, and we met an entity that made the possibility of that statement being literal rather than metaphorical a chilling reality. And then this was flat out confirmed in the Millennium Falcon arc by a curious yet obvious source when you think about it, the Apostle Rakshas. In chapter 233, we see the hideous contraption that is the man-made Behelit for the first time as Rakshas leads the Kushan Bakiraka Prince Silat and his Tapasa bodyguards on a chase from Wyndham City. Upon entering the site of the man-made Behelit, Rakshas comments on the mechanism of the structure by stating that the only reason it worked was because the interiors of the still-living apostles that composed it were linked to the Beyond, which is an obvious reference to the Abyss, which is also the home of Berserk's only outright godlike entity, the idea of evil. During the eclipse, when Griffith's astral body sunk into the Abyss while his physical shell went through a transformation, he ended up meeting the very entity that has been pulling all of the strings in Berserk since ancient times. The idea of evil. This heart-shaped, eye-riddled entity resides at the bottom of the Abyss and is the reason for the existence of both the God Hand and the Apostles. In the case of the God Hand, the idea greets them personally at its residence at the time of their transformation and gives them the powers they desired when they activated their Behelits, along with a single maxim, to do as thou wilt. With Apostles, the idea's influence is more indirect, but still very much present. Every apostle in existence did not merely come across their Behelits by chance, the idea sent it to them because they possessed the right qualities for transcending and becoming true servants of evil. The apostles are given their maxim of doing whatever the hell they felt like doing by the God Hand, which establishes a very clear hierarchy. The idea of evil is at the top of this hierarchy, the God Hand are its direct envoys, and the apostles are base servants, whose existence was naturally inferior and subservient to the God Hand. When a human possessing the qualities for becoming an apostle gives in to their despair and craves power to come over their powerlessness in that moment, their Behelits are activated, which opens a fissure in their heart. This fissure is filled with the power of the idea of evil if the to-be apostle goes through with the requisite sacrifice. Otherwise, the marked person ends up in the Abyss. Speaking of apostles being inherently subservient to the God Hand, that isn't just a mindset thing. The apostles literally cannot help but feel instinctive exaltation and euphoria in the presence of the God Hand, an instinct that the only resistant apostle in the series, Emperor Ganishka, calls maddening. When he speaks with Griffith in his incarnated form for the first time face to face, Ganishka is terrified, not just by the fact that he felt inherently inferior to this man, but also by the fact that he felt a kind of serenity that he had never felt before with Griffith's presence. When the God Hand arrive for the eclipse in chapter 74, the apostles that have surrounded Griffith go into a frenzy at their arrival because of this slave-like instinct, which also compels apostles to go along with the God Hand's plans regardless of their maxim to do as they will. This might seem paradoxical to you, as what's the point of giving a person free rein in life if they end up being bound to another's will, but such is the hypocrisy of the world of demons in Berserk. Many things that the God Hand do and say don't add up, and yet people keep falling for their tricks time and time again because of their inherent darker selves that they have either kept locked up in their human lives or suppressed the hell out of, which only results in them becoming even more destructive apostles in their second lives. The essence of evil that powers them is also the reason why they can transform into their demonic forms, and how they can create pseudo-apostles whom we will look at in another video, and why their souls are dragged into the abyss at the time of their death. So, that's the nature of an apostle's existence from the astral perspective covered. But what about the differences between apostles themselves? Because in the Black Swordsman arc, apostles were depicted wholly as degenerates who had given up on their humanity to become immoral monsters straight from hell. But then, Miura introduced Zod in the second volumized chapter of Berserk, and immediately this guy was different from his kin because, for starters, he was not eating the bodies he was piling up as he single-handedly dismantled Guts' raider unit. More than that, Zod is an apostle that seeks only one thing, and that's the strongest opponent. The Immortal One has been roaming from one battlefield to the next looking for a satisfactory challenge for the last 300 years of his existence, and only when he meets Guts and Griffith does his search finally yield some suitable results. Zod has also shown the ability to restrain himself from indulging in his baser apostle instincts, and he pretty much functions as a berserker general for Griffith in his reborn Band of the Falcon, keeping the rest of his lesser brethren in check so they don't go off eating the humans they were supposed to be protecting. Over the course of the series, we meet several other apostles like Zod who, despite being monsters by nature, showed great restraint and were nothing like the rest of the apostles we've seen in the series. Grunbeld, Locus, and Irvine actually seem like decent people, chivalrous even, and one of them is an honest-to-God knight. You might be thinking, well, hold on here, a knight becoming an apostle? Surely he must be a broken knight of some sort, right? Well, all the stories about Sir Locus make him feel like Sir Arthur Dane from A Song of Ice and Fire, an undefeated lancer who never committed himself to one master and spent his entire life on a peregrination, searching for God only knows what, until one day he resurfaced as an apostle at the Battle of Shet, where he saved several Midlanders from certain death at the hands of the Kushan. Grunbeld and Irvine are similar to him in that they also keep their baser brethren in check, whilst rarely indulging their apostle instincts themselves. Why are these people so different from other apostles like, say, Wild or Rosine? Thankfully for us, Locus explains the reason himself. It's because of the obsessions that triggered their transformation in the first place. According to Locus, apostles are beings that are refashioned into demonic reincarnations through two factors: causality and their own extraordinary obsessions in life. Most apostles follow their baser instincts and do the gruesome things they do because of the very basic nature of their reincarnations. Think about it for a second. Why did the Slug Count actually want to become an apostle? Was it because of tragic heartbreak? Or was it because he desperately wanted to forget about the betrayal he had nearly mopped up himself instead of facing it like a man? Why do you think Wild, who was revealed to be an old, decrepit man after his death, became a vigorous and lascivious ape-like being upon his reincarnation who only wanted enjoyment and excitement? It's because their reasons for wanting to survive beyond their natural lifespans were, frankly put, petty, at least from our point of view. The reason why Locus, Grunbeld, Irvine, and Zod are able to stay in control for the most part and carry on with their apostle duties without getting sidetracked is likely that their reason for accepting apostlhood in the first place wasn't just a simple desire to live, or escape their current lives, or experience joy for the last time, whatever your definition of that might entail. Their reasons were more personal. Zod likely had the obsession of wanting to fight the strongest in his human life as well. Grunbeld wanted to burn all his enemies to ash as he was dying, protecting his friends, hence his apostle form as a massive corundum-skinned dragon. Locus likely wanted to serve a king he deemed worthy of his service, which is why he speaks so glowingly of Griffith to anyone who will hear him out, because to him, Griffith managed to create an inclusive utopia for both humans and apostle kind, which would be impossible under normal circumstances because the two are natural opposites. As Daiba states while witnessing the madness that was the final battle of Wyndham, Griffith managing to get apostles to fight alongside human beings was entirely unprecedented because apostles were heresy to the world of man. As human beings that possessed immense egos and desires, they became infernal reincarnations via dark arts, and existed solely to be reviled. They detested and were detested in turn. They hated the humans, and were hated by them in exchange. Apostles were an abomination to the very concept of humanity, given what they'd done to achieve their forms. But because Griffith's army was entirely clueless about their nature, including his medium somehow, they managed to bypass this adversarial relationship and actually work together. In the current timeline of Berserk, if you were to ask an average resident of its world what an apostle is, they'd likely correct you and call them war demons of the Falcon of Light. But that is all God-hand propaganda, we tell thee. The truth is, Berserk's apostles are like biblical apostles and ancient Greek apostles in a single regard, and that is that they spread the gospel of evil through their actions. At the end of the day, an apostle's will is an extension of the God-hand's will, which is an extension of the idea of evil's will, which governs causality, aka fate, itself in Berserk. By doing as they wish to do, apostles spread evil and terror throughout the world, which is perhaps the message that an antichrist figure like the idea of evil and the God Hand would want to spread in the first place. Chaos and debauchery is the forte of the demons of Berserk, and sure, it's a reflection of the true selves that most of these apostles kept hidden within themselves for a long time, in some cases decades, but the word of this gospel originated from their God, and whether they knew it or not, they've been spreading the word of evil for close to 1,000 years by this point in the story. From a physical standpoint, an apostle can take any shape they think reflects them best. Rosine looked like an elf because she believed she was an elf at the moment of her transformation. Grunbeld became a dragon because he was told by his witch best friend that his prophetic self was a giant red dragon. You get the point. But from an astral standpoint, their existence was simple and their purpose was rather direct. They lived to do whatever they wanted, as long as it fit the overall framework of the master plan of the idea of evil, whatever that may be in the first place. Their loyalty towards the God Hand is such that they will kill rogue apostles if they have to, and yet they're nothing but flies on the wall to that group, despite their clear strengths and abilities. After being introduced as world-ending menaces, they've kind of been reduced to fodder characters thanks to the focus on the higher-level apostles of Griffith's band and the Berserker armor. But don't let that wipe away the fact that apostles are the OG monsters of Berserk. This story wouldn't be half as gripping as it is if it wasn't for them and the reasons behind their existence, and we just hope we've managed to do full justice to that story. Marvelous verdict! But sadly, we've reached the worst part of any marvelous anime video because we've reached its conclusion. Apostles are one of the most intriguing additions to the lore of Berserk because of their paradoxical nature, when they want to, and whenever they want to do it. But at the same time, they're instinctually bound to obey the orders of the God Hand and the idea of evil by extension, failing which they will be taken out with extreme prejudice. They're evil, without a shadow of a doubt, but there are enough of them that will make you question your own morality and definition of evil out there that we cannot use that term as freely as we'd like, and their souls are split between two worlds, neither of which give them their best, although they think that's what they're getting. Apostles are both terrifying and tragic, but that can be said about Berserk as a whole as well. What we really want to hear are your thoughts. What do you think about the apostles? Which ones are your favorites and why? Let us know in the comments section down below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and we'll see you guys in the next one. Until that day, keep on struggling, fellow strugglers.